around the world celebrate their achievements and rally for equality. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. March 8th marks International Women's Day, and this year it coincides with the anniversary of the coronavirus pandemic, a global health emergency that has upended countless lives all over the world. Women, however, have been affected disproportionately by the COVID-19 crisis, facing a number of setbacks. Millions have lost their jobs, millions more are dealing with health and security issues and gender-based violence, which is on the rise. But 2021 promises to build back better, with women leading post-pandemic recovery. There's much to discuss. Let's go straight to our panel. Joining us from Pretoria, South Africa, Mandisa Kalako-Williams is the former Secretary General of the South African Red Cross. Catherine White joins us from London, England. She's a gender expert and advisor within the Peacekeeping Division at the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. From Beirut, Lebanon, Ghida Anani is founder and director of Abad, a Lebanese non-profit organization tackling gender-based violence and gender equality. And with us from New Delhi, India, Priyali Sur is a journalist and founder of the Azadi Project, an organization advocating for refugee women. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Mandisa, let me start with you in South Africa. I've been looking at some figures here from the World Health Organization, which tells us that women in South Africa account for 57% of all COVID cases. In fact, the WHO says that across the continent of Africa, the pandemic has worsened the gender divide. In fact, it's done the similar thing throughout the world. This is the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. She's been talking about that specifically. This is what she had to say. Let's listen.
I think it's absolutely tragic, the impact that this crisis has had on women, especially low-skilled women and minorities.
So, Mandisa, looking specifically at the situation in South Africa, where, as I said, women have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. What is the country doing to address this imbalance, especially at a time when it's struggling to come out of the pandemic?
There is a lot of work that started even before COVID-19 in trying to get women to be where they should be. I always hate saying to be equal to men. They should be equal to themselves. During the pandemic itself, women have come up as high numbers of people who care for people who are sick at home or even at hospitals. So they've invariably then been vulnerable. Even with volunteers out in the field, the highest numbers are volunteers, and therefore their exposure has been higher. So all activities that are being done in providing protective clothing, in providing training, in ensuring that all people that go out into the field and those who receive people coming into the health centers has been to make sure that they are protected as workers as well.
Ghida, let's look at Lebanon. Lebanon has been hit by multiple political and economic crises over the last few years. And if we look at some of the protests, some of the major protests that have taken place in the country against the government, against corruption in government as well, these protests have been led by women in the country. Human Rights had a report, Human Rights Watch had a report in which it said that there are 15 separate personal status laws for the country's recognized religions, and all of these discriminate against women. What is your assessment of the status of women in Lebanon today?
Well, currently we can definitely say that women are taking the burden of the intersectional and the really very complex crisis that is affecting our daily lives, meaning being economic from one side, the collapse of the banking sector, the pandemic itself, with all the lockdown, additionally the political vacuum that was topping by already a very patriarchal system that is influencing the dailies of women residing on the Lebanese territory, I have to say, because in Lebanon we don't describe only the Lebanese women. We have a large number of women that are displaced also from Syria, from Iraq, Palestinian women, among many others. So today the situation is a little bit, if I can describe it, being schizophrenic. In a way, women are actually the one leading the change and leading, being in the forefront to grant and ensure safety for the majority of the population in all forms of crisis, and being, as you well described, in the protest, asking for the change and the system reform, being in the forefront in the health system in supporting patients affected by COVID-19, also being the one rescuing and supporting families affected by the drastic Beirut port explosion that happened last August. So we see them in the forefront, like trying to transmit and secure the lives of others, while themselves are still struggling from multiple layers of discrimination that are affecting their daily safety and the feeling of their own safety. And that is stemming from social norms that are still dominant in a way, considering women as a property and really looking at on anything related to honor that might affect the honor of the family. But also, the most importantly, this is being like really rooted in our policies and our legislations, that still multiple texts are discriminatory against the woman, starting by not allowing her to transmit her nationality to her husband and the child. Also, not having any quota that ensure her political participation, like her active engagement in decisions related to the country. So women are still very behind on when it comes to equal active political participation. And also what is affecting us all, I guess, around the globe, which is still the gender-based violence. Domestic violence is still on the rise as well, and especially during the lockdown. And the rule of law is actually missing. Accountability system is still missing, and also all issues related to women are still not really prioritized on the level of the government, on level of national strategies, and the political will by itself.
Right. Catherine White, if we look at the battle, the fight against the COVID pandemic, and we look at the number of countries that have actually done the best job at fighting this pandemic are led by women. We look at Denmark, for instance, Finland, Germany, Norway, all led by women. They've had the most success in fighting the pandemic. Here in the United States, we've had a bit of a breakthrough politically. The vice president is not just a woman, she's a woman of color as well. Yet, if we look at the business community around the world, if we look at corporate boardrooms, they are underrepresented by women in many, many instances. And in general, we see, as we've just been saying, that women of color in particular have been hit hardest by COVID. What do you believe needs to be done to address these gender inequalities?
I think firstly we need to kind of look at COVID and the pandemic as something that is not gender neutral. It is not gender neutral because our society is not gender neutral, and I think that's been a really big problem with the countries that haven't done so well in terms of how they've responded to the pandemic, because they've started from a position of assuming that everyone is in the same place, whereas of course that isn't the case. And I think once we recognize that when you achieve gender equality, it actually benefits everyone. We're not talking about this being something that is a favor to women. When you work towards gender equality, the economy improves, society improves. It actually directly benefits the world that we're living in. And I think that's something that we have seen with New Zealand, with Denmark, as you say. We've seen a recognition of the fact that women need to be involved, they need a seat at the table, they can speak to social care, to the childcare burden that has led to an enormous amount of oppression heaped upon women who are dealing with 2, 3, 4 kind of different full-time jobs, most of them unpaid. We've got a rising mental health crisis facing everyone, but particularly facing women, because of course when you're having to bear this burden of caring for others, that's something that you carry yourself. And I think we have to start from a point of recognizing that everybody needs to be considered, and once you start there, you're able to actually factor different people in. So there's a great opportunity there as well. I really do believe that, but we have to start from this place of recognizing that we're not in a gender neutral position.
Actually, Catherine, that point that you raised about the role of women in the economy, there was a report put out by the McKinsey Global Institute which said that economic parity between men and women could add as much as $28 trillion to the annual GDP. That's about 26% of annual GDP. But why has there been a failure to recognize the advantages of equality?
A number of reasons. I think in a pandemic, understandably, to a certain extent, health was put first and it was kind of prioritized above all else. Of course, failing to account for the fact that the majority of frontline health workers are women, the majority of informal cleaners, nurses, those people that are on the front lines are women. They're being disproportionately affected. And it wasn't taken into account that actually they have a real role to play in driving forward the economy and bringing us out of this. And interestingly, this is something that we saw at the end of the war, at the end of World War II. Women came and they supported the war effort. They took on jobs that men were doing. They supported driving the economy back to life. And when the war was over, we actually failed. Collectively, we failed to recognize that effort. Women went back to the home and they went back to their unpaid labor. And I think I read the McKinsey report and it was really, really interesting. And I think we need to focus on that and we need to drive forward, economic advancement. We need to look at the role that women can play, and we cannot ignore it anymore. We've made that mistake before, and that's something that the pandemic should teach us.
All right, let's go to India. Priyali Sur, gender inequality in India has been an issue for centuries. There are deeply entrenched practices, cultural practices that discriminate against women. We see that in many instances where families prefer to have male children rather than girls. Then, of course, there's been the horrific violence that we've seen against women in India. We've talked about that on this very show. We've talked about specific cases. How do you see the situation on gender equality in the country now?
Anand, but when we talk about the pandemic and how that has exacerbated the gender inequality issues, I don't think it's a case which is just relevant to India. I think it is something which has exacerbated the gender inequality, as all my co-panelists mentioned, all around the world. And in fact, if we talk about the region, in the Asian countries, in Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific region. So, I would rather speak about the region in general. And I think what we really need to focus on is, as I think Catherine just before me said, that the war had seen these kind of inequalities kind of pronounced a lot more. We have seen emergencies constantly bring about gender inequality and exacerbate gender inequality. The coronavirus is not the first time it has happened. We've in the recent past seen it during the Zika pandemic. We've seen it during the Zika epidemic, during the Ebola epidemic. And every time we have had these discussions, policymakers have come together, we've had these discussions in newsrooms, and we've spoken about what better can be done. And somehow we go talk about these things and we go back to the same thing. And then another emergency hits us and we are talking about what better can we do. The point is that we are in 2021 and we are still talking about how can we do better instead of talking about, what should be the measures in place already.
All right, I'm going to go back to Lebanon. Ghida Anani, according to the United Nations, 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical and or sexual abuse, mostly by an intimate partner during the COVID lockdown. It's a situation that's been especially acute in the Middle East. The UN calls it the shadow pandemic, in fact. Awad, the organization that you had, tackles gender-based violence. Do women come forward and report these cases? What has been your experience of dealing with this in the Middle East?
Well, I would have to say definitely women, they come forward for reporting. The level of awareness has been really quite encouraging during the last years due to the effort of the women movement and different women organizations. Normally, the first, we have multiple frontliners that usually women tend to go to. Either they would go to a health facility first, or to a lawyer, mental health professional, or the social organizations like providing sheltering and case management services like Abad, as holistically or not. But during the pandemic, actually, we have definitely noticed the rise in the number of women coming forward calling our helpline was a kind of 106% increase during the first lockdown, like the first 20 days of the first lockdown we lived in Beirut, which was like indicative, like how much, like really domestic violence is happening behind the locked doors. And we lack data on really knowing the magnitude of the problem. This is the problem in the Middle East. We don't have proper documentation and memory, organizational, sometimes like a kind of, it's more civil society. So on the level of the government, if you now ask like what is the prevalence of GBV in Lebanon or in any country in the MENA region, in the Middle East, you wouldn't have this accurate data. So the magnitude of the problem is usually indicative through the number of reported cases per month by to the police or to organizations. So, and from our practice is usually women would come forward if there's a direct risk on their lives, feeling really threatened, or that of their children, or if they really lack any support system, natural support system like family or else, and they would need support on legal or forensic medicine or mental health, and don't means actually to have more like individual expert to go to.
Okay.
And these are mostly the women that come forward. Yeah.
All right. Mandisa, you have pointed out there needs to be a very big organizational shift, you say, in the role of women. Women are doing all the work, but they play a small role. They have very little say in the decision-making process. And you say that there also needs to be changes at the corporate level. Talk to us about that and how this change can be accelerated.
At the corporate level, one sees women in boardrooms as assistant to the main men or even as CEOs themselves. But if you take that down to where these women come from, the villages where they come from, the women there still have not been brought up into the level of saying, this is what I want my life to look like, and this is what I can do. I think there's a terrible blindness to the potential of all women, which needs to be nurtured, which needs to be supported and protected, because some of the women are not reaching their full potential because of unfriendly situations at home. That gender-based violence thing is very serious, that when you are out there in the boardroom, you are bold, you speak very clearly, but when you get home, you get all kind of intimidated by the situation in the house. So unless we deal with all of that holistically, we are going to talk numbers and not real feelings and as it affects women.
Catherine, there is one plan which is being talked about here in the United States. It's being called the Marshall Plan for Moms. The CEO of the NGO Girls Who Code is calling on the Biden administration here to issue direct payments of $2,400 a month to mothers to compensate them for the unpaid work that they do right now. Do you see an idea like this gaining traction?
I think it's a good idea in principle. I like what it does, which is that it recognizes that unpaid labor and it recognizes that burden that women are facing with financial compensation, which is important. However, I think it's quite short-sighted because it doesn't really provide a long-term solution. What it also does, it kind of pigeonholes women still into their role as mother and as carer. And I think long term, we actually need to look to be moving out of that. We need to be looking at how we need to talk about empowerment. We need to talk about how women can use their own voice and say for themselves what it is that they want to do, what role they want to play. And yes, of course, it's important to provide that financial compensation because the burden is huge. The toll on mental health is enormous. But there's something that doesn't sit well with a lot of women about being placed into that bracket as carer and as mother. We want to include men in that role. You know, what about the fathers who are staying at home? We want to just expand. I think we want to move away from stereotypes as we build back from this pandemic. And for me, we slightly stay situated in that territory with the Marshall Plan, although, of course, it's a good step. It's a good short-term step to a crisis response.
Priyali Sur, what about access to education for women? The education activist Malala Yousafzai, she's been talking about this, and this is what she had to say.
So as soon as this pandemic started, the first thing Malala Fund did was to do a research on the impact of this pandemic on girls' education. And the research shows that there are 20 million more girls at risk of losing their education because it's a health crisis, but it has that economic crisis with it.
So has that had a similar effect in India, Priyali?
Anand, I'll get to this, but can I just respond to the Marshall Program and to Catherine's comment?
Yeah, sure.
So I agree with Catherine. I also think that this is not short-sighted. It is, I think, a step in the right direction. And also, it doesn't mean stereotyping women, because a lot of women actually may prefer to be caregivers and mothers. I know that we are only talking about women in a caregiving role, but this is giving them a choice. This is giving them an option that they can get paid if they choose to be mothers and caregivers. So I think this is a step in the right direction. This should have happened a long time ago. Now, coming to the point of the education, I think this is a great initiative. I mean, education for girls is the primary base for avoiding lots of gender discriminations in the movement ahead. For example, I work in refugee camps, and my organization does a lot of work in refugee camps. What we have been seeing that families are pushed into the corner so much so that they have become they've reached a point of extreme poverty because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, that they cannot send their children, or they cannot afford to send their girl children to school. So there's a loss of education there, and which is pushing them during the pandemic or during now post-lockdown to sell their girls into child marriage. So all of this is very intricately related. So giving access to education to girls is extremely important to avoid other gender discriminations on the path ahead.
Mandisa, there was a report from the Catholic Church a few months ago which acknowledged that South Africa has made some progress in gender equality, but it also pointed out that socio-economic inequality persists in the country. It points out that there are horrific levels of violence against women in South Africa. In fact, a woman dies violently in South Africa every 3 hours. What can you tell us about the situation there and how it's being addressed?
It is painful to say that we are only talking about the cases that then get reported either to the authorities or to the organizations that deal with prevention of violence against women. One shudders to think what happens in the deep rural outlying areas where it might actually not surface and be known. But right now, we are seeing a lot of organizations, women-led, that also have men amongst their ranks, who are taking this thing very seriously and pushing it to the highest level. We've seen protests of women saying bail must be denied to perpetrators, saying sentences must be harsh to perpetrators. And I have to say that I have seen, at least in the past month, 2 or 3 cases where the harsh sentence was really meted out to either a fellow who killed his girlfriend or one who made sure that his ex-girlfriend got killed. And therefore, whilst we are not at 100% in this, we feel that the battle is slowly beginning to make cracks into the minds of both the decision makers and hopefully the minds of the perpetrators and would-be perpetrators too.
Ghida, we've been talking about the impact that COVID-19 has had on the economies of countries throughout the world. What kind of impact has it had in Lebanon and specifically on women in Lebanon?
Well, mainly it was what we have seen is the interruption of the labor, the source of income, because many women had to really let go on their jobs because they had to follow on their kids with the online schooling, while with the banking crisis and the economic crisis that was combined with the pandemic, the crazy change in the rate of the Lebanese and dollars. And many women were relying on helpers and really other women from other countries like supporting them at home. So many women, they actually had to resign from their jobs. In addition, we had a huge effect on mental health and lots of attempt of suicide. That was also something that we have seen on the rise when it comes to women. In addition, of course, to spousal violence, domestic violence, and recurrence of the, we have seen coming back the issue of incest and sexual abuse against girls, as well as trafficking and for commercial sexual exploitation for children. That was also something that we have seen happening again. Some incidents as well, like struggling with the risk of honor killing, especially for women, displaced women coming from Syria, just because if woman had some COVID-19 symptoms, and she wanted to go to an isolation center, she was like a kind of at risk of being killed by the family, just because of refusal of the idea of being alone in a place where they can't see her for a period of time, and so on and so forth, with all these social norms, inherited social norms.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.